And we are just 1 week away from the U.S. presidential election, and Americans aren't the only ones eager to see the outcome. Every nation, whether they're a friend or a foe, has a stake in whether it's 4 more years of Donald Trump or a new Joe Biden administration, and of course that includes Canada. So what would their approaches be to the most challenging foreign policy issues of the day, especially those affecting this country? I want to turn to Gerald Butts now for this. Butts, as you might remember, was Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's former principal secretary and is now a vice chairman and senior advisor at the Eurasia Group. He joins me now via Skype from Ottawa. Jerry, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Welcome to my house.
There you go. We'll see if Room Raider picks you up on Twitter. I want to start by getting your sense of where you think this campaign stands, because a lot of people got it wrong in 2016. What are you watching for right now, and how do you think this race is going to go?
Well, I think the public polls, our call internally at Eurasia Group is that Biden has a 75% chance of winning the election, which is broadly consistent with where you see various public aggregators. We're a little lower than places like 538.com and The Economist, largely because we think there are so many unknowables in this campaign, it's hard to make a definitive call. So 75% chance of a Biden victory is a big chance, of course, but it also means there's a 25% chance we think that Trump could eke out a victory in the Electoral College, even though he's likely to lose the popular vote, maybe by as many as 5 million votes.
Right, and so today, the Eurasia Group, you weren't speaking so much about the state of the race necessarily, but about the direction for U.S. foreign policy, depending on who wins next week. And when you look at Biden, because we have a sense of what Trump is all about, he really has 2 parts of his agenda that could heavily impact Canada. He's got his trade policy and climate policies. And starting with trade, how would Biden's economic approach differ from the policies of Trump in your view?
Thanks for the question, David. I think at the very highest level, it's important. I'm dating myself with this analogy, and you heard me use it once already today, but there are a lot of people who think that this is going to be like the dream season from Dallas. If Joe Biden wins, that they'll wake up the next day and there'll be a new president of the United States who looks like someone they remember from the Obama administration, and everything will go back to normal. We strongly believe that that is not the case, that Donald Trump's presidency was the consequence of a lot of really big, important things that have happened in the U.S. domestic environment. He was not the cause of them. Income inequality isn't going away. The number of Americans who don't have health care is not going away. Their reticence in taking on global leadership roles, that's not going away if Joe Biden is president of the United States. So I think it's important for Canadians, first and foremost, to see this election through that lens, that Joe Biden's sphere of his ambit of activity is going to be more circumscribed than I think a lot of people, a lot of Canadians would like it to be. He's going to have a very difficult global situation to deal with, starting with, but certainly not ending with, the global pandemic that we're all suffering through these days.
That may be the first Bobby Ewing in the shower reference in the history of power and politics, by the way. I just wanted to say that. But, you know, when you look at Biden on trade, like you are right. Like a lot of what Trump is speaking about is a manifestation of underlying issues in the United States. Biden, for example, I know the energy sector here wants to see things like pipelines go ahead, but he's already said he's going to get in the way of, say, Keystone XL and would revoke those permits. So it doesn't necessarily become smooth sailing for Canada and the U.S., but is there any chance it could revert back to a more normal Canada-U.S. relationship and become Canada-U.S. as opposed to Canada-Trump, which is kind of what it's felt like for the past little while?
Yeah, I think you can expect that broadly. We'll get back to the old things we used to argue about, like softwood lumber in Canada-U.S. relationships and the Canada-U.S. relationship. Most people on both sides of the border are fully aware that it is one of, if not the most productive, peaceful relationships economically, socially, from a security perspective, anywhere in the world, perhaps in the history of the world. And the Democrats are certainly well aware of that. On the climate front, of course, which is something I pay special attention to, it's important for Canadians to realize that Joe Biden is running on a climate platform that would have been unthinkable even one electoral cycle ago for a candidate from either of the major parties. We believe it's responding to facts on the ground, not just that California is on fire and there were simultaneously 2 hurricanes in the Gulf for the first time ever. this year. But demographically, the United States is increasingly dominated in its politics by millennials. And this may be the first election, in fact, where baby boomers have not been the biggest voting bloc. It'll be close, but it may be the first one in our living memory, and our adult lifetime, professional lifetime anyway. And we think that's a very big shift because that generation has climate permanently affixed as one of its top three issues. And that's what the Democratic campaign is responding to, facts on the ground. On KXL, and I think that's an important issue of national interest here in Canada, obviously, I lived through both the phone call in the Prime Minister's office, both the phone call from Barack Obama saying he would not approve the pipeline and the phone call from Donald Trump saying that he would. And here we are 4 years after a Republican president who supported the project without the project. So I think that there are bigger issues going on that are factoring into the stasis that we found ourselves in on that particular project, mostly the politics in the United States, which have been facilitated by the growth in the domestic industry in the United States. Joe Biden as president, Donald Trump, and Barack Obama, all three of them, if Joe Biden's to be elected next Tuesday, they have more optionality on oil and gas imports than any president, at least since Kennedy and possibly Eisenhower. That the U.S. domestic oil and gas industry has, of course, grown exponentially over the past 10 years with the shale oil revolution. So they don't need as much of the stuff from elsewhere as they used to. They can afford to be more political about it.
I want to ask you just one last question before I let you go, and this is a question about China, because Canada has found itself really squeezed between the U.S. and China in this trade dispute that has become a large international diplomatic problem. How different would it be under Biden in terms of the approach with China? Would there be a relief of the tension or a continuation of sort of the hostilities that have really amped up under Trump?
I think this is a really important point for Canadians to understand, David, that notwithstanding how polarized the United States politics has become domestically, earlier on this year, there was a motion in the Senate to censure China over its treatment of Hong Kong, and it passed 100-0 in the Senate. There are very few things that could pass this U.S. Senate 100-0, and I say this the day after the first U.S. Supreme Court justice to be confirmed without a single bipartisan a vote from each party on the Senate floor since 1869. It's a very polarized environment. The one thing they agree on is that their approach to China has to change. It may be, other than Venezuela, the only foreign policy issue that has broad bipartisan support. So we believe that we're forecasting that a Biden administration would take a different approach in the sense that he would want to build a coalition of like-minded countries. He would work more cooperatively and constructively through multilateral institutions. But the direction of travel on big foreign policy issues, with the possible exception of climate, is not going to change dramatically.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for your time, Jerry. That's former Principal Secretary to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Gerald Butts. Okay, so next week, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, the result is going to have a significant impact on the global landscape. Their views on the world and America's role in it are starkly different. Now, we were just talking to Jerry Butts about that, how each candidate would affect Canada, but what would U.S. foreign policy look like under a second Trump presidency, under a new Biden administration? For that side of the story, I want to talk to someone now who has worked for the Trump White House. Richard Goldberg is a senior advisor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a Washington-based nonpartisan research institute. He served as a national security aide in the Trump administration, working for both John Bolton and Robert O'Brien. He joins me now via FaceTime from Chicago, Illinois. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate
it. There are a lot of differences between these two men, but what would you say is the biggest difference between President Trump and Joe Biden's approach to the way the U.S. is going to deal with critical global issues?
Yeah, I think largely their divides come in domestic issues when we look at energy production, when we look at environmental regulation, when we look at the economy and taxes and how to grow the economy. And so that's really where the election here in the campaign has taken place. When you look at foreign policy and you get beneath some of the political talking points, the way that the world has really evolved over the last 4 years, it's hard to find a lot of differences beneath the surface. I think rhetorically, you'll have differences. Obviously, the bombast from Donald Trump you don't have with Joe Biden. I think, as your last guest said, a look to rejoin some UN treaties and regimes, international bodies, seeing utility in some of the UN agencies where the Trump administration does not. But when we look at major threats out there, of Russia, of China, Iran, I think that both men sort of see it the same way. It's just a matter of how they will approach it. And I think that bodes well for U.S.-Canadian relations in foreign policy, regardless of who wins.
That's how they see the world, perhaps. But what about how the world views the United States? If you look at the reputational hit abroad, the U.S. has dropped to its lowest ever in decades in some places. In Germany, for instance, China has a higher approval rating than the United States. I mean, how do they come back from that after this election, or do they even need to worry about it?
Well, I think in some areas where the Trump administration started with trade disputes and trade as a priority domestically to reset trade agreements, withdraw the United States from trade agreements, we obviously have ruffled feathers that we have been working to repair. That's going to be natural based on the fact that if you're in a trade dispute and you have disagreements on bilateral trade, we saw this obviously between Washington and Ottawa. You're going to have political spats. It affects people back home. It affects jobs. It affects everyone's economy. Once you're able to work out those deals and start building upon them to expand trade opportunities, deepen bilateral connections, you start looking again at what brings us together. What are our commonalities? What are our shared values? Democracies, human rights, human dignity, all these things. We're against terrorism. We are very cognizant of threats posed by rising powers from China and Russia. And so I think there's a lot of room for us to work together multilaterally. It doesn't have to be in a UN body for it to be multilateral. And I think you're already seeing the Trump administration building some of these coalitions, particularly when it comes to China.
Well, let's talk a little bit about China, because the trade war, the tariff battles have really been at the centerpiece for Trump throughout his first term. Does that change if he's reelected? Does it become less of a political imperative to do it because there's no reelection? And how would it change under Biden should he win?
Well, I think the president's views on trade are pretty well known. They were known before he was president. He campaigned on them. And so I don't think you will see any sort of change in his trajectory when it comes to U.S.-China trade relations and his views of China when it comes to devaluing the currency, the theft of intellectual property, technology transfer, all those list of concerns you've heard about. What I do think you are starting to see, though, is a much more concerted effort to reach out to our allies, to educate them, and make sure we have a common picture of the threats posed by China, not just the military intelligence threats that we know of, but some of the more pernicious activities they're conducting throughout the world. What does their 5G network really mean for their ability to get in to our high technology systems and our intelligence systems? What are they doing in developing nations, really where they're using coercive economic measures to take out minerals and abuse people in the long term? And what's happening in Hong Kong? What's happening in Xinjiang? And what do we need to do as democracies who value human rights to stand up to that? So I think both men, regardless of who wins, will have to tackle all of those points, and we'll have to continue to build a multilateral coalition to counter the rise of China.
Do your allies want to hear that message from Trump, though, given what's happened the past 3-4 years with pulling out of UN treaties, the disruption of things at the G7, the undermining of NATO in a lot of ways? I mean, are America's traditional allies going to hear that message from a re-elected President Donald Trump?
I think that they have to, because it's not for America's interest, it's for their own interest. And I think it's our responsibility in Washington to take the time to educate not just political leaders, diplomatic leaders, but the publics of these countries to understand, what does it mean if China builds your 5G network? What does that mean to your security? What does that mean to the future? Remind people of our shared values and what makes us democracies that hang together. We look at a country like Iran, and there was consternation over the president's decision to leave the Iran deal. But here we are a couple years later, and we remember that Iran is a brutal dictatorship that represses its own people, shoots airliners out of the sky. and that together we as democracies who value human rights, who don't want to see the proliferation of nuclear weapons, who oppose terrorism and their sponsors, we have a responsibility to work together to counter these threats.
Okay, Richard, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much. That's Richard Goldberg, a senior advisor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, joining me via FaceTime.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.